You've probably heard of the final girl trope in horror movies. This is the girl in the slasher movie that outlives her more unfortunate peers and survives until the end, or at least lives the longest. Some notable examples are Laurie Strode from Halloween, Alice from Friday the 13th, Sally from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and, of course, Sidney Prescott from Scream. We've all heard a lot about the final girl over the past couple decades. Too much, I might even say. I've actually heard that Carol J. Clover, the professor who coined the term in her 1992 book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, even refuses to do interviews on the subject anymore. And I'm not surprised, honestly. I feel like we got the point already about final girls and Scream, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Look at Sydney's quippy one-liners and how media savvy everyone in the movie is. Okay, are we done? No? Oh, we're gonna keep doing this? We're gonna keep being self-referential about common horror tropes, but do it slightly differently every time so that hopefully nobody figures out that we're just being smug and self-congratulatory about making what is essentially the same movie over and over and over and over and over again? Okay. As you might be able to tell, I personally feel that throughout most of these countless retellings and subversions and self-aware evolutions, I feel that we have remained shockingly stagnant in terms of covering actual new ground in the genre. It's always all about the final girl. Ooh, look how mousy and virginal and brunette she is. Well, what about the mean girl that gets her skull caved in because she was too busy yelling at the hapless young main character about the alternative milk she wanted in her latte to notice the zombie baseball player sneaking up behind her? Or the slutty bimbo who gets her tits cut off because she wanted to go skinny dipping in the haunted lake with her jock boyfriend, despite the creepy groundskeeper giving them an eerie warning not to? Don't they deserve to live too? Is being stupid and mean and hot such a crime?
I don't like people I have to get to know.
Hey, it's her problem she transferred here, not mine.
Diane, you're a snob.
Hey, only the best people are, you know?
Forget the final girl. What about the first girl? AKA the girl that dies first in the horror movie. Let's talk about her. I say that, but we will nonetheless, even in this video, still have to discuss the final girl before we can discuss why she is deemed worthy of living while her mean and s***y counterparts are not. The term final girl refers to the last girl standing at the end of a horror movie, especially a slasher. Clover points to a common series of traits that final girls have. They're virginal and virtuous, they sometimes have a unisex name, most of the time they're brunette, and explains that their existence is a reflection of how society consumes horror and violence, how we see violence, how we punish people for their vices, and how we perceive gender when it comes to horror is why final girls exist. I'm harping on about how we talk about the final girl too much, but I can see why the trope has had such a chokehold over the horror community up until now. Clover makes an astute observation about the relationship between gender, violence, and punishment, and how it manifests in our media, specifically in our horror media. Clover's overarching argument is that the final girl, while always portrayed by a cis female actress, is almost genderless in a way. Just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine. Not, in any case, feminine in the ways of her friends. And I think there's an argument to be made there if you'd like to pursue it. But growing up, my impression of the final girl has always been someone that was overtly feminine, and also feminine in a way that I could never be. In a lot of ways, I would have shared a lot of the final girl's traits. I liked to read as a child. I got bullied. I didn't know how to dress well. So, yeah, I was a nerd. But I was also really loud, obnoxious, and very much not a thin and pretty white girl. I could never access the genderless femininity of a Lori or a Sally. And I feel like this is the experience of most women of color and of trans women more broadly. A lot of us share features that you'd never find on a final girl on the silver screen, like thick eyebrows, strong noses, broader and curvier frames, etc. In fact, more often than not, trans women and trans women of color in particular are explicitly singled out and otherized in horror for posing a blatant derailment to the conventional status quo. I found a surprising number of horror films with trans women as antagonists. For most genres, gender-bending characters are smaller characters who cross-dress and don't necessarily identify as trans. In horror, though, trans characters like Buffalo Bill are essential to the main plot. They are nearly always a serial killer or monster, and although their actual identity isn't always addressed, their presentation is modeled after trans women. Their trans identity is meant to incite fear in viewers. Trans women in horror are presented as abject beings, or anything that is considered gross because it is outside of the self. Not unlike intersex bodies, black and brown bodies, and disabled bodies are abject due to their transgression of social boundaries. At their core, they are in opposition to the white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual man who is the image of the default normative person in Western societies. Clover herself explicitly addresses the way gender nonconforming women suffer in these movies, but instead of recognizing how this reflects the open hostility directed at women who do not strictly adhere to American ideas about what a woman should be, she writes these female characters off entirely. They were not women at all, she argues, because the narrative is simply coding them as men, which is such a weak argument that I'm kind of in shock. Clover's analysis is very Freudian. She references the slasher's weapons of choice, chainsaws, knives, swords, etc., and shoves them all under the umbrella of blatantly phallic murderers. I'm sure a Freudian would agree that there is some allusion to the penis in a lot of slashers' weapon of choice because they happen to be oblong and don't have a lot of yonic openings. But not me. I think Freud, as always, was full of shit. This is the same guy who said homosexuality is a pathological disorder that comes about when little boys do not receive proper Oedipal identification in their youth. Yeah, Freud basically said, if you don't have a woman around when you're younger, namely your actual blood-related mom to lust after, then you're gonna get all confused and turn gay. I'm going into this in more detail because I want to demonstrate just how ridiculous his line of thinking is. Sure, you can lift some semblance of a coherent idea out of Freud's stupid ravings, but that will be in spite of his theories, not because of it. And you really cannot use any of his reasoning as a basis for your argument without your entire argument being weak as shit. So no, I don't subscribe to the idea that chainsaws and knives are phallic weapons. It's more likely that people just think axes and knives are neat. And more specifically, they're not as deadly as, say, a gun. Just lots of slashing, shredding, and ripping, baby, because the violence, above all else, must be drawn out and savored. It's not a sadistic murder family without the sadism, you know? It's a strategic choice. Now that we've deconstructed the phallic element of the slasher, let's go back to Clover's male coding idea. To give you the full picture, I'll read off the passage in its entirety here. The final girl, for all her survivor pluck, is like Red Riding Hood, saved through male agency. In later horror movies, however, there is no male agency. The figure so designated proves so utterly ineffectual that he cannot save himself, much less the girl. The comic ineptitude and failure of would-be woodsmen is a repeated theme in the later slasher films. In Slumber Party Massacre, the role is played by a woman, though a butch one, the girl's basketball coach. She comes to the slumber party's rescue only to fall victim to the drill herself. It's interesting because I think Clover had correctly identified which kinds of female characters are most often punished in the horror movie, but her conclusion about why the narrative punishes these specific female characters falls short and also doesn't really have a consistent rationale. She says the bimbo character is punished for being too feminine, while the butch character is punished for being too male-coded. There's just no consistency here. It doesn't hold up. Let's look at another example and apply Clover's theory just to see how it works out. The Descent. This should be the ideal movie to test out Clover's hypothesis, right? The main cast is all women. So, according to her, the first ones to go are the ones who are super feminine. And don't forget the male-coded ones. Wait, so who's gonna die first? Well, okay. We'll just see who dies first in the movie. It's Holly, the character that I thought was a lesbian at first glance. She's definitely queer-coded, which, yes, I do think was an intentional choice. She's got the short baby lesbian haircut, the alternative hair color, and piercings. And she makes a few passing comments loaded with man-hating, woman-loving innuendo.
What about you, Holly? Got a man?
Oh, I'm a sports folk like Juno. What? Rebecca too, I think.
She dies first. Probably male-coded though, right? According to Clover. Okay, so who's next? The girl with the next shortest length of hair, Beth. Maybe if Beth hadn't gone for the bob, she would have survived. But the next death shows that this might not have been the case either. Rebecca, who thus far has been pretty feminine and boy crazy, is the next to get her throat ripped out. And then her sister Sam. Both sisters were never shown as particularly masculine and were almost coded as hot Scandinavian model types. So why did they get the chop? Well, the hot Scandinavian model might be sexy and exciting, but she's a little too full of herself, don't you think? A little too proud of her beauty. Pride and vanity are not things a good Christian girl should have. Are you picking up what I'm putting down here? The common denominator between the dead characters is not that they're male-coded or that they're too feminine. Their problem is that they do not fit the right idea of femininity. We'll get into what defines the right idea of femininity in a moment. I'm not just pulling this observation out of my ass either. Anna North of Jezebel observed this in an article about The Descent published over 11 years ago. The Descent, originally released in the US in 2006, this Chicks in a Cave flick is one of my favorite films of all time. It's also pretty misogynist. These women die in order of masculinity, a friend pointed out. The ones who act the most like men die first. Also, their bodies are horrifically mauled. Andrew Cooper, author of Gothic Realities, The Impact of Horror Fiction on Modern Culture, points to recent movies like Sorority Row, The Descent, and the new Nightmare on Elm Street, where any female who is too unpleasant gets it in the end. Two types are still a certain death sentence for a woman in horror: the bitch and the slut. The bitch will die bloody. If a woman mouths off too much, you know she's gone, he says. I think a lot of people make this mistake of placing female characters into this dichotomy where on one side is a girly girl and on the other side is a tomboy. But in the case of the prototypical American horror movie, we rarely venture beyond the girly side, otherwise known as the conventionally feminine side. When characters do break with this feminine mold, as in the case of queer-coded characters like Holly in The Descent or the butch character in Sleepaway Camp, they are swiftly and brutally done away with so that the audience can return to ogling the hyper-feminine women on screen, unknowingly stumbling toward their own brutal deaths. Laurie and Sydney as the final girl are not overtly feminine, no, but they are thin, manicured, and conventionally attractive. They wear no makeup and have shoulder-length brown hair. She might wear dad jeans and long skirts instead of a micro mini and skinny jeans, but she's not wearing anything that would make you look twice at her if you passed her on the street. In fact, she's fairly average. And that's the point. Clover tries to explain how the final girl is genderless but she actually ends up providing a pretty good description of the prototypical American good girl. The final girl is, on reflection, feminine enough to act out in a gratifying way, a way unapproved for adult males, the terrors and masochistic pleasures of the underlying fantasy, but not so feminine as to disturb the structures of male competence and sexuality. The final girl is not a girly girl, no, but she's also not a tomboy by any means. She's the epitome of everything a good Christian girl should be. Not too outspoken, not too confident, not too boy crazy, and white. Oh, sorry, I mean brunette. She is the societal ideal. She is gender, or the American ideal of the female gender. The girls who die first in the horror movie aren't being punished for their femininity. They're being punished for performing the wrong kind of femininity. If the final girl encapsulates everything the modern American girl should strive to be, the first girl is a dumb slut who should have paid more attention, or a dumb mask chick who needs to mind her own business. And let's just get her the hell out of here, right? These female character archetypes suffer, but the root of their suffering is ultimately the same. Between the bimbo and the butch, both of them stray too far from the American idea of what a woman should be. While I say that, there's obviously going to be more room for the bimbo than there is for the butch, right? I'll link some good videos that talk more about this in the description box. Filmmakers inevitably weave their own fears into horror movies, and when the majority of filmmakers are cis white men, the most tangible fear is anything that threatens the status quo. That manifests often in the brutal murder of the first girl, the bimbo, the slut, who was too sexually active and promiscuous to be a good Christian girl, but it also manifests in male killers that fail to embody the masculine ideals of American society. Trans people challenge the comfortable boundaries of society by way of crossing gendered lines and sometimes sitting between or outside of them, depending on hormones, surgery, and gender expression. In a society that strictly constructs two genders, people who disrupt that binary are viewed as abject beings. Horror capitalizes on this fear with its depiction of transgender characters, specifically the murderous trans woman trope. If a killer is revealed to have been intersex or to identify with a gender different than the one assigned to them at birth, it's incorrect to assume that the killer is being punished for having female sexual characteristics. Because intersex people who are born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit the boxes of cis female or cis male, exist. Trans people who identify with a different gender than the one assigned to them at birth exist. You do not want to be the first girl. The first girl's mistakes are not redeemable. You've made mistakes, but you may still be saved. You will suffer, but you will not die. You will be virtuous, and you will inherit the earth. Don't believe me? Let's go back to The Descent for a moment. The movie ends with the reveal that Juno was having an affair with Sarah's husband, who died in a car accident along with their daughter the year prior. Sarah, at the climax of the movie, wounds Juno in the cave and leaves her to be eaten alive by the crawlers before running off, falling down a hole, and getting knocked unconscious. When she wakes up, she sees sunlight streaming into the cave. She follows the source and escapes. She not only lives, but gets to do so after exacting revenge against those who have wronged her, killing the woman who was having an affair with her husband. That's where the US version ends. But that was actually an alternate ending. The original ending didn't stop with Sarah escaping the cave. It continues with Sarah awakening in the cave, having hallucinated her miraculous escape. She never got out. And whether she will remains unknown. That's the end of that movie. Can you guess why they released one shortened version in American theaters? In the August 2006 issue of Entertainment Weekly, It was stated that the ending was trimmed because American viewers did not like its uber-hopeless finale. Lionsgate marketing chief Tim Palin said, "It's a visceral ride, and by the time you get to the ending, you're drained." I think this change, more than anything else, encapsulates the cultural weight of the final girl in American horror media in particular. If horror is a mirror of the society it comes from, the prevalence and endurance of the final girl as a trope serves to remind us how boring and formulaic American society continues to be. So maybe it's time for us to just kill the final girl already.